there, and let's jump right into our first discussion about setting boundaries. Today, we're going to dig into physical boundaries and what it means to set them in your life, in your relationship, as well as thinking of them as a form of self-care. So when you think about setting boundaries in your life, I want you to keep in mind that it really is a way for you to love yourself and other people well, and to make sure that you're not compromising who you are, what you stand for, what you're okay with, what you're not okay with, all of those things at someone else's sort of want or at your own expense, okay? So from a physical boundary perspective, this shows up in lots of ways. The best way you can think about it is putting like a physical space bubble around you. You know that idea of like what your personal space looks like, and if you've ever been in a situation where someone's a real close talker and they're like all in your face, and as you back up, they get closer, and then you back up and then they get closer, and it feels like they're invading your personal space bubble that you've put around you. That's really the best way to think about physical boundaries. It's really just any unwanted touching, closeness, some sort of maybe just doesn't feel like a shared experience. So another example of how this might show up is, let's say someone comes in to give you a hug, and maybe you're not a hugging kind of person. Maybe that's just not your comfort. So instead of hugging back, you put your hand out to shake theirs, right? It's not bad for you to not want to hug someone. This actually shows up a lot in adults that will come talk with me from a therapy or a coaching perspective, that maybe when they were growing up, they remember being told that they had to hug their grandmother or aunt or uncle or someone that maybe they just didn't know very well, and it felt forced, or it felt like they were required to hug someone or to show physical affection in a way that maybe didn't feel authentic to them. As a kid, sometimes we don't feel like we have a lot of ability to set those boundaries, to determine what is and isn't okay with us. And from a physical perspective, it is so important to be able to say, you know what, this is the type of touching I am okay with, and this is the type of touching I'm not okay with. And it's not wrong for you to not want to touch someone or not want to have someone in your space, or to feel like you need to set a boundary of how much distance you actually want between you and the other person. Early on in my graduate school career, I had a teacher that actually, none of us knew each other, and she had us each pair up. And so she would have us start on opposite corners of the room and walk towards each other. And we were both instructed to say stop when the person was close enough for comfort. Right? And it was really interesting because there were a lot of expectations and perspectives that came to light that a lot of us had never really thought about, how much someone else's personal space may not match our own. Okay, now you might be hearing this and thinking, okay, boundaries are great, physical boundaries, I get it. But how does that show up in a romantic relationship? Because aren't I supposed to want to touch my partner? Isn't that something I'm supposed to be okay with? So some examples of how this might show up in an actual personal romantic relationship could be, maybe sometimes you do feel like cuddling and other times you don't. Maybe one of you is a real cuddler in general and just always wants to be right next to you. And maybe at times you need some space to say, I love you, but I also need to just feel kind of just a little separate in my own space for a little bit. And I think in relationships, sometimes that's really hard because the person wanting the space may feel guilty for asking for it, whereas the person that's wanting to be all close and cuddly might even feel hurt or, kind of just, what's wrong? Is this a bad thing? Am I reading too much into what this means? So I think it's important to be able to talk about it. And that's the reason I include a link to my relationship communication guide, because it helps you have those really difficult conversations. And I also want you to go back and think of the 4 agreements that we just got through talking about, and this idea that you're showing up at your best. And if you're putting your words out there and letting someone know through a boundary, using your words impeccably and saying, this is what I am and am not okay with, it's on the other person to really meet you where you are. Now, yes, I also hear this a lot. Well, isn't there supposed to be compromise in relationships? Yes, there is. There's meant to be some feeling of compromise where both people's needs get met. So if I'm working with someone where maybe one person is super touchy and the other person doesn't want touch at all, we have to come up with maybe a system or a schedule or a way to regulate that so that the person who wants to touch all the time doesn't feel like they're never getting that feeling of closeness, but that the person who doesn't want to touch all the time doesn't feel smothered and feels like they can have their autonomy and their separate space. Boundaries are not hard in theory. They might be a bit complicated sometimes to figure out exactly how to implement them in different relationships. And that's the reason I'm spending the time going through each one of them individually, because I really want to give you a roadmap that you can follow of what boundaries look like, of helping you go back and use that fence analogy that we talked about in the last video from last week, as well as how to develop a shared understanding with the people in your life, what you are and aren't okay with. I also want to say a quick note. Physical boundaries, although yes, the sexual boundaries that we're going to talk about in a few weeks fall under a similar heading. Physical, emotional, and intellectual boundaries are all wrapped up in the sexual boundary category. So before we talk about the sexual boundaries specifically, we want to talk about like the non-sexual physical boundaries, the emotional, and the intellectual boundaries before we dig into that. So in case you're wondering, like, wait a minute, physical, doesn't that include sex? It's like, yes, it does, but we want to make sure we go through all of them so that you have a really clear understanding of it before we tackle that one. So I do hope you will come back next week as we continue digging through this series on boundaries. And as always, please let me know what questions you have so that I can address them either in my next video or even in my podcast.